Hello, and thanks for coming to my show. If you don't already know, this show is done in themed seasons, and we're on Season 18, Killer Kids. If you like this channel, not necessarily the crimes, you can hit like on the video and subscribe to the channel for weekly stories. You can also check out my other channel, Somewhere Sinister, which isn't entirely true crime, more true crime adjacent. A link is in the description. Thanks. On an overcast morning in 1993, Doreen had let her 4-year-old son walk just down the block to the local summer day camp. They held summer activities at the park 1/10 of a mile or 1/8 of a kilometer down the street. When the rain rolled in and the events got canceled, Doreen went to pick her boy up, but he was nowhere to be found. This is Monsters. Eric Smith was born on January 22, 1980 in Savona, New York, to Randy and Tammy Hevner. Randy and Tammy were high school sweethearts who got married when they were still teenagers. They had a daughter together in 1979 when Tammy was only 17 years old. Not long after that, they separated, but Tammy was already pregnant when they did. Tammy married Theodore Smith, who went by Ted while she was still pregnant with Eric. Tammy had suffered from epilepsy and took a medication called trimethadone since she was 5 years old. She continued the medication while pregnant with all of her children despite it being known to cause birth defects. Tammy eventually took Randy to court for not paying child support, so he claimed Eric wasn't his child. Eventually, Ted legally adopted Eric and he and Tammy had their own child a few years later. Savona, New York is a very small town in the western part of the state. In 1993, it had a population of 974. That kind of small town is where people generally say that kind of thing couldn't happen here. But it did happen. When Eric was a few years old, he developed slowly, taking longer than average children to learn to walk and talk. He would also frequently hold his breath and bang his head against the wall. When he was 3 years old, he got up in the middle of the night and lit a bunch of papers on fire on top of the kitchen stove in their trailer home. By 9 years old, Eric was said to be a heavy smoker. He would go on to show the classic combination of behavior associated with serial killers. He wet his bed, he was fascinated with fire, and he killed small animals. On top of killing animals in the area on his own, when Ted takes the boy hunting, he said that Eric really enjoyed gutting the animals. The Smiths' next-door neighbor was a man named Archie LeBaron. Archie was retired and living alone with his 2 dogs and 3 cats. One day in 1989, Archie went outside and saw Eric sitting on his back porch with one of his cats on his lap. When he got closer, he realized that the cat was dead. Eric had put a hose clamp around the cat's neck and tightened it until the animal was dead. Archie cried out, "What are you doing?" That alerted Ted, who came out of their house to investigate. Upon seeing the dead animal, Ted didn't say anything. He just kicked Eric so hard that Archie was concerned that the boy might be seriously injured. After Eric went inside, Archie said he had a hard time forgiving the boy, but would later say, quote, "I was so damn mad and excited. A child doesn't get himself into the frame of mind of killing a cat that way unless he's spent a lot of time thinking about it. It took me a long time to forgive him. I can't explain to you the right words, but you know you can't hate a child." Eric would eventually apologize and try to make it up to the neighbor by doing yard work for him. In school, Eric clearly had a learning disability. He was held back twice, so by the time he was 13 years old, he was only in 5th grade. Even then, he had a hard time keeping up with the classwork. The school decided that he didn't need to be put into special education classes, but that seems like it was a mistake. His teacher would go on to say that he had a wide shift in moods. He would be cocky one minute and shy the next. Teachers said that he liked to make people laugh and was best described as the class clown. He was said to be a pretty good reader, though, and regularly checked books out of the library. Unfortunately, they weren't always age-appropriate. He was a fan of Stephen King and anything else that depicted violence against children and pets. Eric was a big fan of music, especially country western. He played the trombone in school band and was learning how to play the drums. He was very active in sports. He played soccer, baseball, football, and basketball. He tried to be involved in all the usual activities for kids his age in order to fit in. Eric was never told that Ted wasn't his biological father. Despite seeing Randy regularly, he believed that he was only his older sister Stacy's father. One day, another classmate had found out the truth and told Eric. From then on, he was bullied about being adopted. Of course, there's no shame in being adopted, but mean-spirited children sometimes try to make the adopted child feel like their biological parents didn't want them. That bullying was only added to the bullying over Eric's looks. He was pale, freckled, and wore thick glasses. Eventually, Stacy claimed that Ted had sexually abused her twice, one when she was 11 and again when she was 14. The authorities were involved, and in court it said that Ted and Tammy admitted that he had touched Stacy's breasts inappropriately once. He was made to leave the home for a week and had to receive psychotherapy. The entire family went to group counseling, but that wasn't enough for Stacy. On her next visit with her father, she said she wanted to live with him and he agreed. From then on, Stacy was no longer in the Smith household. In May of 1993, Eric was given a story writing assignment by his teacher imagining something made out of clay that suddenly comes to life. Eric wrote a story about a clay figure who came to life called Crucified Chris the Evil One. Part of the story read, quote, "I moved back. He opened his eyes and asked me if I wanted to play a game of war. I said, why not? All of a sudden, he gave me a sword and a shield. I took the first swing. I missed. He hit me with a spike in the leg. My cut was 3 inches deep. I took the second swing and chopped his arm and half his whole body. The next swing, I killed him. I chopped his head off." The essay ended, quote, see you in hell, my soon-to-be dead friend." The teacher was unsettled by the story being about killing something, chopping off body parts before ending with his head, but they didn't seem to do anything about it. At home, his violence was escalating. He punched Ted in the face and attacked his little sister, so Ted stepped in and told him he needed some type of outlet for his rage. He told Eric that, as a youth, he would often go into the barn and punch a bag until he was exhausted. Hearing that, Eric left and came back a while later with bloody knuckles. He told Ted that he had gone outside and punched a tree. Eric had one good friend, Jason Heskell, who was the son of family friends. Jason was dyslexic and also the victim of bullies, so the two were able to relate to each other. At the end of July of 1993, Eric and Jason spent a week camping at Babcock Hollow. It's a commercial campground where Eric could swim and play video games. He ran around and had fun like a perfectly normal 13-year-old boy. Nobody could have imagined what he would do the very next day after returning from the campground. Derrick Roby was born on October 2, 1988 in Savona to Dale and Doreen Roby. He had one younger brother who was 18 months old in 1993. He loved animals, t-ball, and fishing. By the age of 4, Derrick had learned how to ride his bike and how to swim and was happy to have been able to participate in the local summer day camp. He had been going to the camp every weekday for the 3 weeks before the weekend at the end of July. That Sunday, Derrick's grandfather said he was extremely excited to go back. He had dinner and ice cream before going to bed in anticipation of the next day. The Robys lived on the corner 1 block down the street from the park, with the elementary school on the other side of the street. Doreen had walked Derrick to the park every morning and watched him run into the field to play. On August 2nd, the baby was fussing and it was causing them to be running late. Derrick was anxious to go and begged his mother to let him walk by himself. Since it was such a short distance, she gave in and agreed. She packed his lunch with a sandwich, a banana, some peanut butter cookies, and a bottle of Kool-Aid. He gave his mother a kiss goodbye and excitedly ran out the door to the camp. Doreen would never see her son alive again. Eric returned home on Sunday, August 1st, and was set to join the summer camp program at the local park the next morning. Eric arrived at the park at 9 a.m., but soon after got scolded by one of the youth leaders for riding his bike in an area he wasn't supposed to go. He wasn't told to leave the camp, but in his anger he did. As he rode his bike up McCoy Street, he saw little Derrick walking by himself, and due to his rage of being reprimanded earlier, he decided that he wanted to hurt him. Eric told Derrick that he should take a shortcut through the woods, but the boy had been told not to talk to strangers, so he resisted at first. Eric told him it was okay because he would go with him. That seemed to comfort Derrick, and he agreed to follow the teen into the woods. Once shrouded by trees, Eric let Derrick go ahead of him, and as soon as he had the chance, he reached his arm around the boy's neck and began strangling him. Derrick squirmed and kicked until Eric partially released him, but that was only to turn him around and start strangling him with his hands. When the child stopped struggling, Eric thought he was dead, so he laid him on the ground. Suddenly, Derrick gasped for air, and Eric dumped out his lunch bag, picked up a napkin, and shoved it into the boy's mouth. By then, Derrick had gained enough strength to bite down on the attacker's fingers, causing him to cry out in pain. He would later say that it hurt, but it didn't leave a permanent mark. Eric grabbed a small rock and hit him 3 times on the side of the head. Then he found a bigger rock, said to weigh about 26 pounds or 12 kilograms, and dropped it twice onto Derrick's chest and once on his abdomen. Needing a break from all the hard work, he grabbed the boy's Kool-Aid bottle and took a drink. Then he poured the rest out on Derrick's face. The woman who lived in the house on the property said she heard a short scream that morning but thought it was a cat. It's believed that she heard Eric cry out when Derrick bit his fingers. She would later say that she will never stop regretting her decision to not go and investigate. Eric would always maintain that he was not sexually abused by Ted, but generally that's a precursor to an attack that involves a sexual aspect. Eric would also claim that Ted had never physically abused him, but we know that's not true because other people physically witnessed him being abused, so it's possible that he was lying about both, but the sexual abuse has never been proven. After smashing Derrick with a rock, Eric pulled off his pants, rolled him over, and shoved a stick into his rectum. He then rolled the 4-year-old back over and dragged him to a more secluded area next to a pile of rocks. It's said that the killing took about 10 minutes, and though Eric left right away, he went back to the area multiple times over the following hour to make sure Derrick was dead. He would later say that if he lived, he would say something, but as long as he was dead, he believed he was in the clear. A neighbor pulled out of her driveway at 10:10 a.m. and saw Eric riding his bike in the road. He went back to the camp a few times that morning, with people saying nothing seemed out of the ordinary with him. The forecast had called for a rainstorm, and they were not wrong. It wasn't long before the rain started falling, and organizers canceled the rest of the day's activities. Eric headed home, and after noticing a few small spots of blood on his clothes, he made sure to put them in the wash. Doreen hopped into her car and drove down the block in the pouring rain to collect her son, but as the other children were running home or to their parents' waiting vehicles, she didn't see Derrick. She found one of the counselors and asked where the boy was, but the girl gave her a puzzled look and said that Derrick hadn't been there. Doreen immediately panicked and raced back home where she called her husband at work. Then they reported Derrick missing to the police. By 11 o'clock, the search was on. The police were out and they had dispatched a helicopter. Firefighters were searching the area, shouting Derrick's name. Neighbors, including Ted and Eric, were looking in streets, parks, stores, and other people's houses. At 3:45 p.m., a woman found Derrick's body in the woods. Her scream alerted the area that the search was over. When authorities arrived at the scene, they found the little boy's broken body laying on the ground under the canopy of some trees. His shoes had been removed, with his left shoe near his right hand and his right shoe near his left hand. The cookies and sandwich from his lunch were also missing, but the banana was laying on the ground, partially smashed. The odd staging of the scene would be an aspect of the case that would never have an answer. When the autopsy was complete, the medical examiner found that Derrick had multiple skull fractures, contusions, a perforated intestinal wall, and petechial hemorrhaging of the face, neck, and eyes. It was determined that his cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head with contributing asphyxia. There was no semen found on the body or at the scene, so it was believed that there was no sexual assault besides the stick in the boy's rectum. Of course, nobody would immediately think another child was responsible for Derrick's death. The police investigators didn't find any clues of who the killer was at the scene. Some residents said they saw an unfamiliar green pickup truck parked on McCoy Street earlier that morning, so some investigators looked into that. Otherwise, they didn't have a lot to go on, so they called in a criminal profiler. The profiler said that they were likely looking for an adult pedophile. The perp was likely a sex offender who was possibly on parole. As teams split up, with some looking into the green truck and others looking into parolees in the area, every adult resident of the town was interviewed. The children in town weren't all questioned, but since Tammy Smith had mentioned that Eric was riding his bike in the area that morning, he ended up being one of the first minors they talked to. On August 5th, Tammy drove Eric to the police station where they both sat in an interview room where the 13-year-old boy answered questions. After the interview, investigators noticed some discrepancies in his story, so later the same day they went to the Smith home where they talked to Eric again. Eric told them that he was riding his bike up McCoy Street at about 9:15 a.m. on August 2nd when he saw Derrick walking on the street across from the open field. It was right on the other side of that field that Derrick's body was found. Eric was able to describe exactly what the boy was wearing and what his lunch bag looked like. During the interview, Eric said he was cold and paused the interview to go get his jacket. When his mother was helping him put it on, he told her that detectives thought he did it. She would later say that he seemed visibly shaken. When he returned to the interview, the investigators were trying to determine exactly where Eric was when he last saw Derrick, but the teen stopped and said, quote, "You think I killed him, don't you?" One of the detectives said that Eric brought his fists up to his face and was visibly shaking. Then Eric said, quote, "I'm not the type of person who would kill, hurt, or sexually molest anyone." The statement caught the detectives off guard because the details of the murder had not been released to the public. Definitely not the detail about the stick and where it had been placed. Eventually, Eric's great-grandfather, Carl Peters, arrived at the Smith residence and asked for the investigators to leave. He was a retired sheriff's deputy and took over the role of Eric's protector. The investigators needed to get to the bottom of Eric's statements, so they returned about an hour later with the district attorney and asked to continue the interview. Carl reluctantly agreed and also let them make a video of Eric riding his bike down McCoy Street. During that interview, family friend Marlene Heskell was at the house and she would later say she noticed inconsistencies in the teen's story. She said that Eric was very clear up until he claimed to have seen Derrick, then his whereabouts got muddled. Another part of Eric's story that was in question was the amount of detail he recalled about Derrick. Eric's glasses were broken, so he hadn't been wearing them the day in question, which was confirmed by his mother. When Eric rode his bike up and down McCoy Street for the police, one detective stood in the spot where he said he saw the little boy. But without his glasses, he couldn't see much more than a blurry outline of a man. How had he seen exactly what Derrick was wearing and specifically what his lunch bag looked like? It seemed hard to believe. The investigators left when it got dark, but returned the next day to reenact the events of the morning again. That time, Eric's story was a little different, and by then, the detectives were starting to wonder if Eric was making it all up. He seemed to like the attention he was getting, and the authorities started wondering if they were just wasting their time. The investigators weren't finished with Eric, though. They needed to know for sure exactly what he had seen that day, so they took him, accompanied by Carl and Ted, back to the station for one final sit-down interview. At some point, they took a break and Ted brought the boy a cup of red Kool-Aid, and when Eric saw it, he flew into a rage. He swatted the cup and spilled the liquid all over the place. Family members were confused by the outburst, but the detectives knew that the red Kool-Aid was an important detail at the crime scene. Again, having a hard time believing that the murder was committed by a 13-year-old from the neighborhood, investigators started considering that Eric may have witnessed the murder. The police told Ted that they didn't think that Eric had seen anything and they were allowed to go home. Meanwhile, investigators had interviewed the man who owned the green truck and looked into parolees and sex offenders in the area, but they didn't come up with any new leads. Eric's family and their friends seemed to be more suspicious of the boy than the police were. After the murder, Eric had stayed over at the Heskell house and Marlene found a number of things suspicious. Eric asked her what would happen if the killer had turned out to be a child. He was reading articles about the case in the newspaper and highlighting statements. Then, when his friend Jason drew a map of the neighborhood where the crime took place, Eric took the map and drew a line directly from Derrick's house down the street and into the woods where the murder took place. She wondered how he knew exactly where the crime scene had been. Marlene knew that Derrick's lunch had been taken, but the banana had been left behind, which gave her the impression that the killer probably didn't like bananas. She went to the store and bought ingredients to make banana splits, but when she offered them to the boys, Eric asked if he could just have ice cream. When she asked him why, he responded that he didn't like bananas. After an incident where Eric intentionally burned the end of Jason's nose with a cigarette while her son slept, Marlene told Eric he was no longer welcome at their house and drove him home. That same day, John Heskell took the map drawing to the police and told them that Eric had been bragging that the authorities didn't think he had witnessed the killing. Back at the Smith house, his entire family held a sort of intervention. His parents, grandfather, and great-grandfather all sat him down and asked him what he knew. They encouraged him to tell the truth, and he finally broke down and said, quote, "Mom, I did it. I snapped and I done it. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. I killed that little boy." After those words left his mouth, Tammy lost control and grabbed her son, yelling at him to tell her why he had done it. Eric started crying and said, quote, I don't know why." Once the commotion was over, Eric's great-grandfather, Carl, called the police and reported the confession. 6 days after the murder of Derrick Roby, Eric Smith arrived at the police station to make a full confession. When Eric told the investigators the truth, all of the details perfectly matched the evidence recovered from the crime scene. He delivered the story matter-of-factly with little emotion, shocking the family members who were in the room. One detective said that after a while, Eric actually started getting more and more animated, like he was excited by retelling the story. He had to remind him to calm down, as the reason they were there was quite serious. When a press conference was held to announce the arrest of Eric Smith, the town reeled from the news that a 13-year-old from their own community could be responsible for such a heinous crime. Not only were other adults affected, but other children in the area had to live with the horror of having spent time with him. Jason Heskell was so traumatized by the news that his friend had killed Derrick that he would end up needing counseling. Eric's first court appearance was on August 11, 1993. The prosecutor immediately announced that he would be trying Eric in adult court. That meant that he would need to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. His family was frustrated because they had willingly turned the boy in and believed that he would be treated as the juvenile he was, where he could get the appropriate treatment. In the state of New York, a defendant can be tried as an adult if they're charged with murder and are at least 13 years old. The case was polarizing, and the prosecutor likely wanted to make an example out of the boy for carrying out such a brutal crime against a child who was so young. At the court appearance, Eric pleaded not guilty of murder. Since there was no facility set up to house juvenile offenders in the local county, Eric was housed at the Monroe County Department of Social Services Detention Center about an hour and 15 minutes north of Savona. The officer that drove him back to the detention center after his court appearance said that the boy asked him if he thought he would be back home in a week. Eric's lawyers claimed that his psychiatric evaluation would prove that he has a pathological rage disorder and that he should have his trial moved to juvenile court. The first psychiatrist, Dr. Peter Cormack, said, quote, Eric harbors a great deal of anger and rage that relates to feelings of rejection and/or abandonment. On occasions, when his rage builds up to a sufficient intensity that it is directly expressed, He can become rather detached from his own actions, taking little personal responsibility for what is occurring and not giving consideration to anything other than what is happening in the moment. Depressed moods as well as anger, including angry or hostile outbursts, result when his efforts at control do not serve to block painful feelings. Although Eric does not demonstrate any signs of significant cognitive or intellectual impairment, the mental disease from which he suffers is such that he was unable to appreciate either the legal or moral implications of his actions at the time of the crime. It is doubtful that he appreciates these factors even at the present time. The second psychiatrist, Dr. Stephen Herman, said that both Tammy's use of trimethadione during her pregnancy and physical and mental abuse from Ted caused the boy to have an intermittent explosive disorder. He said, quote, Eric was born with certain constitutional or organic vulnerabilities, born with fetal trimethadione syndrome. Developmental delay, school, and speech problems are all part of this syndrome. Eric suffers from pathological rage attacks as evidenced by his abnormal temper tantrums, breath-holding spells, and headbanging. As he grew, he was unable to modulate his anger appropriately. He grew up with serious self-esteem problems, unable to ignore the teasing of other children, academic problems and difficulties with peers, and low self-image. His family did not provide much in the way of intellectual challenges or psychological support. He grew up a lonely child, easily hurt, cried frequently, also developed a sadistic side expressed in cruelty to animals and in his attack on Derrick Roby. At the time of that attack, however, I do not believe that Eric meant to kill the child. I believe that his rage overtook him, and he was completely driven by pathological anger, which was then out of control. Thus, I can say with a reasonable degree of medical certainty that the attack was not a premeditated murder, but rather a tragic result of Eric's pathological rage. Due to Eric's lawyers using a psychiatric defense, the prosecution was also allowed to have Eric evaluated by their own psychiatrist. Dr. Kathleen Quinn came to the conclusion that Eric did not suffer from an intermittent explosive disorder and actually has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is not a major illness, nor a reasonable explanation for the murder. After the evaluations were complete, the prosecutor denied moving the case to juvenile court. He said, quote, This isn't an accident of youth. This was a calculated act. I truly believe that Eric Smith is a budding serial killer. There are clearly people who make choices which reflect pure evil. In my view, this heads the list. Of course, like mentioned in other cases in this season of child killers, the brain isn't completely developed in a 13-year-old boy. But on the flip side, Eric did show all the signs that he would grow to become a serial killer. It's hard to say which detail is the one that would predict his future. Eric Smith was indicted on one count of second-degree murder. That means he willingly committed a murder with malice aforethought, but it wasn't premeditated. Eric didn't plan to kill Derrick before he spotted him and lured him into the woods. The next tactic used by the defense was to submit a motion to suppress Eric's confession on grounds that he didn't understand his rights when they were read to him. The thing about that was, the detective who read the boy his rights made sure to read the rights as they are supposed to be presented, and to interpret them in language that a 13-year-old could understand. When asked multiple times if he understood, he said yes. His guardian was also in the room with him for the confession, and they were also aware that Eric had the right to remain silent or have a lawyer present. The motion was ultimately denied. During the trial, Eric's full confession was read to the court, and people can hear how the account is framed by the teen. He explains the details like he's describing his regular daily activities. People in the court were frustrated by the lack of answers that Eric gave. He never gave an explanation of why he chose to brutally kill a random 4-year-old. The lawyers gave competing theories, that Eric was suffering from mental illness, and that Eric was inherently evil and on his way to becoming a full-fledged serial killer. But Eric himself would never give an answer to the question that so many were asking. The defense argued that Eric didn't have an intent to kill when he met Derrick. The prosecution said that he couldn't have been in a rage when he committed the murder because if he was, he wouldn't have remembered all the details so vividly. It was a knockout, drag-out fight for the future of a 13-year-old murderer. On August 16, 1994, the jury reached a verdict and found Derrick Smith guilty of second-degree murder. They said their decision ultimately came after hearing the testimony of 2 other young children who Eric had tried to lure into the woods that morning before the murder of Derrick. Eric Smith was clearly riding his bike around the neighborhood looking for a victim before he finally found one. On November 7th, Eric was given the maximum sentence possible for a juvenile offender, 9 years to life in prison. Eric made a statement that said, quote, "I know my actions have caused a terrible loss for the Roby family, and for that I am truly sorry. I've tried to think as much as possible about what Derrick will never experience. His 16th birthday, Christmas, anytime, owning his own house, graduating, going to college, getting married, his first child. If I could go back in time, I would switch places with Derrick and endure all the pain I've caused him. If it meant that he would go on living, I'd switch places, but I can't." Eric's defense appealed the conviction and the sentence, but both appeals were denied. In July of 1997, Eric's defense lawyer excused himself from the case, saying he was moving out of the area. He also said that he had been ignorant of certain legalities and had not represented his client as well as he could have. The new lawyer requested a new trial based on those grounds, saying, quote, "Mr. Bradley marched Derrick into the jaws of death." The judge reviewed the case and denied the request for a new trial. Eric was held at Brookwood Secure Center, a maximum security prison for juvenile inmates aged 13 through 17. After 3 years, he was then transferred to an open prison for young adults. In 2001, he was transferred to a maximum security prison. He was denied parole 10 times between 2002 and January of 2020. After the 2012 hearing, the parole board cited a concern for public safety in its decision, in addition to the opposition of Derrick's parents to his release. At that hearing, he told a parole board that he would not return to Savona if released and would go to a shelter or halfway house instead. During his 2004 parole hearing, he told the board that he got a good feeling from killing Derrick because it was someone else being hurt instead of him. He told the board that, if he hadn't been arrested in 1993, he would have likely killed again. In May of 2002, Derrick Roby testified before a panel of New York State Assembly Republicans in the fight to pass Penny's Law. The law is named after 39-year-old Penny Brown, who was sexually assaulted and murdered by a 15-year-old in 1999. The legislation would increase the mandatory sentence for juveniles convicted of second-degree murder in New York from 5 to 9 years to life to 15 to 25 years to life. The law was eventually passed and went into effect on November 1, 2003. In October of 2021, Eric Smith was released on parole after spending 27 years in prison. He was 41 years old. The Robys fought against his parole every time it came up, but after it was finally granted, Dale said, quote, "What he did to our son should be enough to keep him in there." Eric said he had a fiancée and planned to live near New York City. His release was delayed until he found approved housing, but he eventually moved to Queens. He said he wanted to work as an electrician or a carpenter. The MacDonald Triad is the collection of 3 traits in youth that are supposed to predict if a person grows up to become a serial killer: bedwetting, an obsession with fire, and cruelty to animals. Despite being only 13 years old, Eric displayed all of those traits and even admitted that he would have likely killed again had he not gotten caught. It seems that locking him up may have actually been the right decision, but now that he's out, do you think his compulsion to hurt others is gone, or is he still a monster? If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.